Hello viewers, I'm Ron Grant coming to you live and direct from Tortola in the British Virgin Islands. You're watching 284 Media. Now, of course, you all know that the recommendations for the Commission of Inquiry have been shared, and in that is a suspension of the Constitution. We are taking a look at what a suspension of the Constitution will look like. How will our lives change here in the British Virgin Islands? Turks and Caicos share their experiences. In August of 2009, the British government took direct rule of the People's Government in Turks and Caicos, where they were to take temporary control pending new elections after the UK Foreign Affairs Committee accused former Premier Michael Missick. The temporary rule conditions is said to have turned into a full-scale government takeover of the islands by the British, including the British government scrapping the island's constitution and installing a new constitution created by the British, giving themselves full power permanently. It is alleged that since the British takeover, the British have cleaned house of Turks and Caicos locals by removing all locals in government officials and replacing them with British officials. Land belonging to islanders have been illegally confiscated by the British. Civil servants have been made redundant. Foreign residents are given voting rights in future elections, thus disenfranchising islanders' votes. The laws have been written to favor, it is alleged, the British agenda, and many more changes implemented without the vote of the people. Now, the governor has scrapped all branches of government and runs the government and the special prosecution team without separation of powers. Today, viewers, I am joined by Damian D of the TCI. He is a media professional, and we're going to discuss what this will look like for us based on their experiences. We'll be right back after a quick commercial break. You're watching 284 Media.
Yo, everything good, Dad?
Aye. This thing got me one way, Daddy.
What you mean?
Ever since I hook up with this thing, can't eat, I can't sleep. This is the first thing I touch it when I reach home.
What you really? Hey, this ain't like you know.
Dad, this thing got me staying home, keeping out of trouble me.
Wow. What your name is?
Shit. I talking about my CCT life.
Don't worry about missing your favorite series, sports, news, and local programming. Come to CCT today and sign up for CCT Live to access over 80 channels. CCT Live. Bring it home.
1 month free trial turn into 5. 5 months turn into, well, you know I huff. I watching ball. I been watching football. Dad, Nickelodeon, Paw Patrol. I am hooked. Hook, I tell you.
Viewers, welcome back. As mentioned, I am today joined by Damian D. of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Damian is a husband and father of 2 boys and a proud native of the island of Grand Turk, the capital of Turks and Caicos Islands. Since January of 2021, he has been the Deputy Director of Radio Turks and Caicos, RTC 89.1 FM, the national public service broadcaster of the Turks and Caicos Islands. Damian has more than 15 years of experience in the TCI media and communications industry, working in media, marketing, corporate communications, and public relations. He recently became the first local chartered public relations practitioner. Now, prior, viewers, to being appointed at RTC, Damian spent the previous 3.5 years with the TCI Governor's Office as the Policy, Support, Media and Civil Society Liaison Manager and TCI Chevening Officer. This included leading matters in education and the environment. Viewers and Damian, welcome to 284 Media. Damian, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ron.
I want to begin by really putting into perspective. I ask you to share your background, of course, but I want you to share the background into the UK establishing direct rule in the TCI. How did this come about?
Well, the UK establishing direct rule in the TCI came about after a commission of inquiry similar to the one that took place in the BVI. Our commission of inquiry here in the Turks and Caicos Islands took place between 2008 to 2009 after accusations of corruption and dishonesty and by public officials. Now, many persons originally were opposed and probably still are opposed to the commission of inquiry that took place in Turks and Caicos Islands, as you know, we believed, like persons in the BVI believe that there were other ways to have handled the situation. The British originally sent a team of parliamentarians to look into matters in the TCI, and they returned a report saying, there was essentially nothing here to see. But after things in the TCI from an administrative standpoint, when we were hit by the hurricanes, became quite difficult, where public servants weren't being able to be paid on time. We weren't being able to, as a country, meet our debt commitments and a few other things. The British then decided to take a second look, and that resulted essentially in a commission of inquiry. And it did have some reverberations in the UK as well, where British officials were essentially reprimanded, to my understanding, in essence, for their role, or what persons believe were their role in matters in the TCI. The commission of inquiry, or rather the imposition of the suspension of the Constitution, in my opinion, is essentially taking a hammer to kill a mosquito. And I don't mean that accusations of dishonesty or malfeasance or anything like that is something to be taken lightly, but I don't believe that you should suspend people's democratic right in any essence over malfeasance or over what we believe is abuse of power. There are avenues in which to handle those types of situations. I think the only way you suspend the country's constitution, in my opinion, is essentially through acts of war or genocide or something along those lines, where it is extreme, where life and limb are at risk.
Understood. I want to put this into perspective for the people, though, Damian. We mentioned of the COI 2008 to 2009. That's when it actually came about. Based on research, a temporary rule condition is said to have turned into a full-scale government takeover of the islands by the British, of course giving them a full power permanently, which means, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, the UK still has full permanent power over the Turks and Caicos Islands even now. Am I correct?
Actually, no.
Okay.
That is incorrect. The UK actually returned the island's constitution, or reinstated a new constitution, in 2012.
Okay.
That constitution, which was restated in 2012, was opposed by many local politicians and persons in the TCI, residents and citizens, and the British eventually changed the 2012 Constitution and gave us something similar to our 2006 Constitution, but it's not the exact 2006 Constitution. There are certain safeguards, essentially, that they say have been put in place.
Okay. Now, I want to get into some negatives and positives based on your experience. What would you say were some negatives and or positives to the suspension of the Constitution in the TCI?
Well, outright, firstly, and the most obvious one, is the suspension of people's democratic right to choose their own leadership. Again, I don't think that should happen under any circumstances unless there is, life and limb at risk. You should not take away someone's right to freely choose who they wish to lead them, even if you don't like their choice. The other negative definitely is the impact of the ongoing SIP trials, Special Investigation and Prosecution Team trials, which to this day is still taking place more than 10 years later. The trials were initiated, I think, in around 2015 or thereabout, and is still going on. Now, admittedly, I must say that there has been a lot of procedural stuff that had to be gotten out of the way. The accused have appealed numerous different accusations all the way to the Privy Council. And so this is what has essentially dragged the trial out. Now, the unfortunate thing is that it has a societal impact, as in this cloud is still hanging over the country. Because of the ongoing trials, which the judge, which was done by Judge alone, and the judge, Justice Harrison, in the original trials, passed away last year. And so we had to have a review to find out whether or not we would see retrials. And so now that has been agreed to and is proceeding in this situation. The DPP, Eugene Atuanye QC, decided that the trials would go ahead, and a new judge has been instated. And so the retrial is going on. But the cost to the country, the economic cost, has been tremendous, as the country has spent over $100 million now so far on these trials. And so one has to ask themselves, whether persons are guilty or not, is this the right type of justice? Is this the right form of justice? And what are you willing to pay for this justice? So those are some of the negatives. Definitely some of the positive things, right? Because there's nothing in life that is all bad. There's nothing in life that is all good. Some of the positive things that have resulted in from the commission inquiry is the installing of the Integrity Commission, which is supposed to assure that we are able to hold persons in public office accountable, right down to myself as a deputy director of a public sector institution. I have to file with the Integrity Commission my declarations of interest every year. Also, another positive has been, the ability of civil servants, I think, more or less to speak up more, because whether we want to admit it or not, there was somewhat of a hesitancy during the previous Michael Mizzig administration, where civil servants were reluctant to speak out on issues. That being said, is it still do we think we have absolute free speech? I don't think so. I think there's still some reservation by persons to speak out through fear of victimization. So I don't think some of the things that the Commission of Inquiry was supposed to address have been actually addressed in full. You may have scratched the surface, but there's still a lot of things that came out of the commission inquiry that haven't really been addressed, including, the issues of security and so forth.
So I want to give the public a general understanding of prior to the suspension of the Constitution in TCI and thereafter. I want to talk about some of the direct changes that would affect the day-to-day lives of citizens. Was the civil service cut? What sectors saw any cuts, if any? Were taxes raised? What did it look like before and after?
Well, with the institution of the interim government, which took place from about 2009 to 2012, you had an advisory council and a consultative forum. So the governor essentially selected individuals to advise him on matters of governance, and they included persons from the public and private sector. And then there was a consultative forum that was similar to the legislature, but they had no actual official power, but they debated bills in the consultative forum, but the governor ultimately had the final say. Now, a lot of persons out of that consultative forum actually, eventually when the Constitution were instated, several persons became MPs. Now, in terms of the day-to-day life, it became very difficult from a socioeconomic perspective for persons. It was not easy during the interim administration. Some of that had to do with I think, the heavy-handedness of how things were done literally everything needed approval from British officials. We had a CEO or chief executive officer that essentially ran the civil service. We then had a chief financial officer that made all financial and economic decisions. So things were really, really strict. And you did have several other British officials throughout various different government departments. And so it wasn't just the installation of those British officials that made things difficult. It was also the fact that the country essentially had financial challenges because of the way the money was spent by the previous administration, the Michael Mizik administration. So while I cannot say whether or not there was corruption, that's for a court to decide. I mean, some of the spending and decision making definitely called into question, ethical choices and whether or not, as public officials, ethical choices were being made and the
Understood.
benefit of people of the TCI. Now, I think persons essentially, even those who supported the commission of inquiry originally essentially came to resent it because of the stain it put on the country, and we're finally kind of moving away from that. We're finally kind of moving forward and saying, okay, we're putting the commission of inquiry behind us. We're essentially moving towards a stable economy. So again, another good thing that came out of it is that the Turks and Caicos, from a financial perspective, has had a more stable government in that sense. We've had
Understood.
continuous surpluses, but there's still some drawbacks in terms of the restriction of the size of the civil service, where government cannot spend more than 40% of its recurrent revenue on the civil service, which means we have manpower challenges from that aspect. So there has to be creative ways of officials finding, being able to do the job they're actually hired to do.
Yes. I want to talk about issues just as simple as crime, education, and infrastructure. Let's take a look at those top three areas. Were there areas of improvement within crime? Did crime increase? Did it decrease? Did education get the support it needed, as well as the infrastructure?
In terms of crime, crime has been a continuous issue and continues to be a problem in the TCI. I mean, we've recently had an uptick in serious violent crime, including gun crime. But during the interim administration, which was ran by the British governor, I think crime didn't improve. It didn't really improve. The way we address crime didn't improve. Border security didn't improve. Did we see a huge uptick in crime? No, not a tremendous uptick in crime, but in my personal opinion, people started to notice crime more, and you did see a slight rise in crime. All right, but in terms of being able to address the criminal activity, I didn't see any improvement, and I still don't see much improvement. And that's not me trying to impeach the reputation of the Royal
course.
Turks and Caicos Islands Police Force. It's just that we continue to have tremendous challenges, and persons in the public continues to call into question the decision making of the force's executive, including the commissioner. And the current commissioner has said in a recent interview that even if he's dismissed, the country won't see an immediate change in the crime situation because there are things that need to be addressed, and so therefore just simply getting rid of him won't address those issues. Now, one of the things during the interim administration, when we had our constitutional review, which I see is being proposed for the BVI as well,
Yes.
looking at your Commission of Inquiry report, is essentially the same playbook, in my opinion, that the British are suggesting. During the review of the Constitution, I essentially gave a constitutional presentation, where I proposed the the creation of a police commission. And I still think that that is one of the best viable ways to hold the police force itself accountable to the public, is by creating a police service commission, where the police now become more accountable to the public, even though the governor may still have responsibility, because the big cry that we continue to hear from public officials and from the general public itself is that the governor has all of the say, but the politicians have all of the financial responsibility, and therefore there's a disconnect. Now,
Understood.
over the years, I will say that there has been some improvement in terms of the political establishment working along with the governor to improve things in the force, to provide the force with resources, training, and the like, but there's still much to be had.
As it pertains to education
Now,
and the infrastructure.
um, infrastructure, in my opinion, uh, there wasn't really much done with infrastructure in the TCI during the interim administration. I don't know if that was intentional or if that was simply as a result of focusing on governance issues. But clearly there wasn't much done with infrastructure, and it leave much to be desired. With the return of elected government, we saw much more spending on infrastructure and the things that the people of the TCI actually wanted, because the British took out a $300 million plus loan, which our government essentially had to pay back. So even though the loan was taken out in our name, the people of the TCI had no say in how that money was spent. That was decided by the UK interim administration. So where and when the money was spent and what it was spent on was completely decided by the governor. Myself, as a morning talk show host, then I asked the Governor Gordon Weatherall at one point, where was the money being spent, and he declined to respond. And I can even remember at one point where he said the loan, our loan was sold to a different creditor, and I asked him who, to tell the people of the TCI who the loan was sold to, and
Yes.
and again he declined to respond. In terms of education, I don't think education suffered in the sense that the country was still going through financial difficulties. So no matter who was in charge, we were going to see challenges in terms of scholarship funding and those things. But was there an immediate improvement within the 3 years of the interim administration? Absolutely not. There was no huge uptick in spending on education or social programs. As a matter of fact, we saw a lot of cutting when it came to social programs, when it came to how much we spent on scholarships. You saw a reduction in the civil service. Again, the justification is that the country just could not afford it at the time because of the debt level and the lack of funds, essentially to pay for civil servants, to pay for services and those sorts of things. Persons were being, prior to the interim administration, persons were being paid late. The government had to borrow money simply to pay salaries. And this was all brought out by the hurricanes of 2007 that made it
Yes.
quite clear we could not respond to taking care of our own people. Does that mean that I think an interim administration was the right move? No, absolutely not. I still don't think it was the right move. I still question what benefit was it to the TCI, while there were some things that came out of the inquiry, like more robust audit procedures, better financial management, building of good governance institutions. Those things, any independent person looking at it could say, what, those are essentially good things. But how much did it cost us to actually have these so-called good mechanisms in terms of the impact on our governance structure, where ministers now cannot give direct, direction to civil servants. They
Right.
have to do it through permanent secretaries, who essentially are the ones that actually run the civil service, with the civil service being under the deputy governor.
Now, speaking of the civil servant, I have to ask, the system of government being an overseas territory of the UK is, of course, similar to that of the BVI, where we both have the UK appointed governor who is responsible for overseeing the administration of government, and in particular, he or she is the head of the civil service. Shouldn't he or she be held responsible for the systemic failures of government system as well, in your opinion?
I fully agree, that the British absolutely have some responsibility to bear, a great deal of responsibility to bear as the overseeing powers. It would essentially, I equate this to, if your boss came in and said, Ron, everything you're doing is wrong and you need to be reprimanded for it, but your boss took no responsibility themselves for what you actually did, when they could clearly see all along what you were doing, right? And so I equate what the British did to that. You saw what was going on, but you took no action to correct it. Now, I posed this question to a British official some time ago, and one of the things they said, that if the UK had stepped in, it would have looked like they were being heavy-handed and taking away the elected government's right to make their own decisions. I can kind of see that, but at the same time, if there's justification, then put it to the people and let the people make the
Absolutely.
decision. And that's my argument.
Damian, with that in mind, how is it then that it is always the local leaders who have very limited power as it relates to the overall administration on the systems of a government are the only ones who are held responsible in these COI reports? Now, in this case, of the BVI COI, nothing under the control really of the governor was the subject of the COI. They were, for example, prior major issues in the BVI where corruption in the police force is high. The governor has responsibility for the force, yet the commissioner did not look into that. Where there are similar concerns, areas under the government in the TCI, why is it that only local leaders are held responsible when many of these are under the responsibility, especially when it comes to the service of the governor and deputy governor?
Ron, now there was and there still is those types of concern in the TCI. Persons in the Turks and Caicos are very much concerned about how the governor is held accountable. Essentially, in the constitutions of all of the overseas territories, the governor is a diplomat and therefore cannot be held responsible for anything, essentially. And plus, I don't imagine the British will be spanking themselves on the hand and saying, no, we shouldn't do
Very
that.
true.
That being said, we did have one of the former ministers who, the former minister of education, essentially took a plea deal and pleaded guilty and had to repay $1 million. And this was in January of last year. Now,
Okay.
with that, I'm not impeaching guilt or innocence on any of the other her co-defendants, her former colleagues. My concern is that with the TCI and the ongoing SIP trials, we see where all of the developers that were named in the report have essentially gone free with a slap on the wrist. They've paid fines and have been allowed to continue on with their business, whereas we have local politicians who are now being held under criminal trials. And you have to ask yourself, is that right? I mean, we have the phrase where we say Caesar's wife must not only be pure, she must appear to be pure. So if the British are saying that, they have purity here, how is this right where persons who have clearly committed a crime or been involved in the commission of, or allegedly involved in the commission of crimes, are allowed to go free without any recourse. And so I think partly the public is at a loss here because we haven't addressed the issue of what happened with developers, the alleged bribery and other things that may have taken place according to the Commission of Inquiry report. So that's one thing. When we look at areas of responsibility by the governor, and whether or not the governor was doing his job, clearly there was things where the governor could have done a much, much better job. Now, the governor did come back and give evidence, but was it satisfactory? I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But I think that the British themselves have to realize how it looks. It's like one rule for you, and then there's another rule for us.
Indeed.
And that cannot be ignored. It doesn't matter what you say. No one likes to be told you are lesser than me. And essentially, by not holding developers to account, by not coming out themselves and saying where they may have fallen down as the overseeing power, you're essentially telling people there's one rule for us, one rule for developers, and another rule for you. And that will not be ignored by any person in the public. I mean, it's just basic public relations. You have to understand that. So holding local politicians to account, especially where it's costing the public hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the day, I don't think anybody, no matter what the outcome of this trial or these trials, are going to be satisfied. Because when you look at it, the country has lost hundreds of millions of dollars that it could have put into other services like education,
Correct.
like social welfare and things. And if let's say persons are acquitted, then what was this all for? And if persons are
Indeed.
found guilty, was it justified? Was the amount of money spent? I think we've now spent more money than any trial in the history of the United Kingdom. So
Wow.
is this type of justice worth it? Was there other ways it could have been handled? And I think in the situation of the BVI, I'm not advocating guilt or innocence on the part of anyone, but I think officials in the BVI need to do what officials in Turks and Caicos didn't do, which is come together and be honest with yourselves and say, okay, we may have had some challenges, but here is how we propose to fix these challenges with the assistance of the British. If you're saying that we have these deficiencies, then sit with us and let us iron out a sound plan to move forward and remedy these deficiencies. That didn't happen in the TCI. In the TCI, everybody essentially took their own political corners and pointed fingers, and a divided house cannot stand.
Thank you so much for that. Now, do you think the issues in TCI were all corruption, or were some of them maladministrative issues?
I think a lot of them may, in the end, be proven to be maladministrative issues and not necessarily where people set out to be corrupt. Now,
Okay.
clearly, based on the Commission of Inquiry report, there are some things that you cannot say was not corruption if it is true, because until they're convicted, it's still alleged, right? So if they're convicted, there's clearly some stuff in that our Commission of Inquiry report that makes you think twice, right? Now, with that in mind, I think a lot of what we see is an issue of culture. And I say that to the point where some things we do in the overseas territories that are vastly different from the United Kingdom. And I'm saying this as someone that's worked in the UK government. I've worked in the UK for a while when I was overseas, and you see the differences in work culture. There are
Yes.
clearly things that we would do that they would never do, that they would absolutely frown upon.
Correct.
And so it makes me wonder sometimes if this is not a matter of cultural differences and misunderstandings sometimes. Now, Does that mean there was no maladministration or there aren't deficiencies? No, there absolutely were some deficiencies and still are some deficiencies, even with some of the things that have now been implemented. As a matter of fact, the procurement ordinance has been one of the most challenging things that persons have found to work with. It is consistently a sore point for many public officials, from elected officials downward. Would I say scrap the procurement ordinance? No, not necessarily, but I would say it definitely needs some looking at and seeing where things can improve and where it can be made to work better for the intended purpose. Right now, if you as a public official want to do a project and that project is going to cost more than $1,500, you have to source 3 quotes for that. And what you find often is just so that persons don't have to go out and go through that quotation process and all of this, people will oftentimes have persons, and I'm not saying that they're instructing persons to do it, but persons are doing it, vendors are doing it. They'll come in below that $1,500 because everybody's aware of what the procurement procedure
Just
is.
because, yeah.
So vendors will come in, will come in below that $1,500 just so they can secure the contract. And if you decide that, okay, there aren't 3 vendors that can supply the services or the products that we need, but you only have 1, then you have to do a single source justification, and there are other paperwork that comes with that. So people find it cumbersome to work with, and it's a sore point. And it's one of those things
Understood.
that you say, yeah, it can be a good thing, but for right now, it's a very cumbersome thing, and it can be a stumbling block often.
Understood. Damian, earlier today, like in the Turks and Caicos, we too, as residents, protested, staged a demonstration in front of Government House, of course, with the UK representative now being present and beginning consultations and discussions with local leaders. With the possibility of the suspension of the Constitution for 2 years, let's put this into perspective for the Virgin Islands people. What should Virgin Islanders, and perhaps some may say it's too late, but moving forward with the possibility of this in mind, what should they be considerate of? What should they be aware of as it pertains to just how they speak up and deal with situations, particularly the possibility of the suspension of the Constitution moving forward?
In my personal opinion, I think no one should ever take the suspension of the Constitution of a country, a democratic country, lightly. So even those persons in the Virgin Islands that may support the Commission of Inquiry and that may support, the UK taking action, you have to consider the implication of the suspension of your Constitution. That is a serious infringement on your democratic right. And I always say people fought, bled, and died for you to have the right to vote, and you should not take it lightly. And so that, for me, should be a primary concern of everyone, including the UK government. This action should not be taken lightly. While you can have positive outcomes, there are definitely, in my opinion, a net negative. And TCI, is an example of that. There has been net negatives in terms of suspending our Constitution and what we've gone through. But I think we're starting to come out better on the other side. The country is in a better financial position than it has ever been. We have record economic numbers, social security services are improving. So we're getting past it. But for the people in the BVI, they now have to consider all of those things. What is the socioeconomic impact of something like this? It could have a chilling effect on public servants who may be afraid to challenge British officials that are brought in. So public servants may now be afraid to do their jobs. I don't know if the BVI is in the same financial position that we were in 2008, where we couldn't pay our debts. If the BVI
We are not
is,
today.
then you have to look at whether or not Okay, because I was about to say that, look at whether or not there would be a loan taken out by the British that you now have to pay back and you have to pay the interest on. And one of the things that I think the Rufus Ewing administration that came in after the reinstatement of our Constitution, one of the smart things I think they did was to pay down that debt and to pay it off, essentially giving us back control of our financial mechanisms for the most part, not entirely, because there's still certain financial checks and balances within our Constitution that government has to adhere to, including, sending a fiscal plan to the UK for approval. Now, I think that the people of the BVI need to sit down and decide what is it that they want. What do you want to see, right? Because it shouldn't be about what the politicians want. It shouldn't be about what the British government want, but what do you really want to see as BV Islanders? And then think about, is the suspending of your Constitution or possible suspension of your Constitution the best way to attain those aspirations? And if it's not, then you need to say, are we holding our leaders accountable? And be honest with yourselves and say, can we do more? And if more can be done, then do it. As for politicians in the BVI, I would say they need to sit down and decide, was the administration or previous administrations doing all they could to serve the people of the BVI? And the answer to that is that no, and that there have been things, questionable things going on. Then again, be honest and come together, put forward a plan to the UK government and say, listen, we don't want a suspension of our Constitution. Here's how we plan to move forward with this, and we'd like your assistance rather than your control. And the UK government itself has to look at whether or not imposing direct rule on another territory is good for the UK itself. What message does that send in the international arena? Is it that the only way the UK knows how to actually fix a problem is by taking control of everything? So they have to ask themselves, how will they be seen and judged in the international arena, and what that looks like for them? Also, how will this, improve relations in any way between them and the territories? And I don't just mean the BVI, but all territories, because I'm sure Cayman is looking at it. I'm sure Bermuda is looking at it. I'm sure Anguilla and Montserrat and other territories are looking at it and saying, okay, here we go again.
Damian, I want to thank you so much for your time and honesty. Of course, having been through a very similar situation, the Turks and Caicos Islands, like you mentioned, are finally getting to some point of progression and progress, and we continue to wish you and your citizens over there the very best. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your experiences, and we do wish you all the best.
Ron, thank you, and of course, I thank the people of the BVI for having me and being able to share our experiences, as a sister territory.
Beautiful. Viewers, that is all the time we have. Reporting for 284 Media, I'm Ron Grant. Do have a beautiful rest of the evening. Bye-bye.